Some things you know before they happen. Not because you're paranoid. Not because you're negative. Because you've lived the same story enough times that your body starts reading it before your mind catches up. You feel it in your stomach first. That quiet drop. That low-level dread that settles in a few days before your birthday, like weather you can smell coming. I stopped pretending I didn't feel it when I was 9 years old. My name is Saoirse, and I want to tell you what it feels like to grow up as the second choice in your own family. Not occasionally. Not during hard seasons. Every single time. Like clockwork. Like a script they never got tired of running. But what happened when I finally stopped showing up for it? That's the part that changed everything. We were 4 people in a house on a quiet street. Mom, Dad, my older sister Renata, and me. Renata was 3 years older, which sounds like nothing until you grow up in a family where 3 years is enough of a head start to completely colonize your parents' emotional attention. I wasn't unloved. I want to be fair about that. I was fed, I was clothed, I went to a decent school, and on ordinary days my parents were perfectly fine people. But the moment Renata needed something, and Renata always needed something, I stopped existing. She had a gift. I recognized it even as a child, even before I had language for it. She could make a problem feel like an emergency, and an emergency feel like a disaster, and a disaster feel like the kind of thing that required every adult in the building to drop everything and gather around her. She wasn't performing exactly. It was more instinctive than that. She simply understood, somewhere deep and wordless, that the world moved toward her when she fell apart. So she fell apart strategically. And my birthday was always the most convenient time to fall apart. I didn't fully understand the pattern until I was 9. Before that, I'd just felt it, the disappointment, the confusion, the vague sense that something important had been taken from me without anyone acknowledging it. But that year, the year I turned 9, something clicked. Renata was 12. She had a stomachache that morning that turned into a migraine, that turned into a fever, that turned into a whole-day production, that ended with Mom sitting on her bed until midnight. My birthday dinner, a pizza place I'd been excited about for 3 weeks, was quietly postponed to next weekend. Next weekend never came. I remember lying in my bed that night and understanding, with the cold clarity that only children can access, that this was how it was going to be. Not an accident. Not bad luck. A pattern. And the pattern wasn't going to change because the people running it didn't see it as a problem. That was the night I started building walls. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't throw a tantrum or cry loudly enough for someone to come in. I just went quiet in a new way. A way that would take me years to recognize as the beginning of something permanent. By the time I was 12, I had stopped expecting anything different and started observing instead. I watched how Renata operated. The timing of her crises, always within 48 hours of something important to me. The way she calibrated the severity, never so dramatic that it required a hospital, always dramatic enough to require our parents' full presence. The way she'd recover so completely and so quickly once the event she'd disrupted had passed. I didn't hate her for it. Not yet. I was 12 and what I mostly felt was a cold, analytical distance that probably should have worried someone if anyone had been paying attention to me closely enough to notice. I didn't see it coming yet. Not the full shape of what this would eventually cost all of us. But I was starting to take notes. The year I turned 15, I made my first calculated move. I decided that if I made my birthday small enough, simple enough, low maintenance enough, Renata would have no reason to disrupt it. What was there to compete with if I competed with nothing? So I planned a dinner at home, cooked by Mom, which she liked doing anyway. Just the 4 of us. No friends, no restaurant, no occasion grand enough to threaten anyone. Renata called from a friend's house that afternoon in tears. She and the friend had a fight. She needed Mom to come get her. Mom came and got her. Dad and I ate dinner at the table without them. He tried to make conversation. I answered in complete sentences and looked at my food and understood that there was no version of this that worked. There was no small enough, no simple enough, no low maintenance enough. It wasn't about the size of the occasion. It was about the occasion existing at all. My birthday was a threat just by being mine. After that, I stopped trying to engineer around it. I just waited for it to happen and let the numbness absorb it when it did. 13, 14, 15, each one a variation on the same story. A crisis, a phone call, a pained expression, the same words. You understand, don't you, Saoirse? Of course you understand. You're the easy one. The easy one. That phrase followed me for years. It was meant as a compliment. I think my parents genuinely believed it was a compliment. What they never understood was that easy was not a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. I was easy because being difficult had never changed anything. I was easy because I had learned very early that my needs had a ceiling my sisters never did, and performing emotional pain only ever made me feel worse. So I compressed it. I packed it down into something small and dense and carried it quietly. I was easy because it was the only option I had been given. The truth was worse than anything I'd ever let myself say out loud. When I was 17, I stopped telling myself the comfortable lie that this was temporary, that things would level out, that eventually my parents would see the dynamic for what it was and make some kind of correction. I had watched enough birthdays disappear to know that correction was not coming from inside the family. The system was too comfortable for the people who benefited from it. Renata's needs were always urgent. Mine were always patient. And patience in that house was not a virtue. It was a standing invitation to be deprioritized. I started making plans that didn't include them. Not dramatically. I didn't announce anything. I just began building a life that existed outside their field of vision. I got a job at 16, opened my own bank account, started saving. I studied hard because I understood that a scholarship was an exit door and I needed one. I cultivated friendships with people who showed up. I learned what it felt like to be someone's first call instead of their afterthought. By the time I was 17, I had a best friend who remembered my birthday without a reminder, who showed up with exactly the right thing, who made me feel like my existence was something that mattered rather than something that needed to be accommodated. I started to understand what I'd been missing. And then I turned 21, and everything I had quietly understood for 12 years became something I could no longer compress. I was in my second year of university by then. I had built a real life away from home, friends who knew me, a boyfriend named Daniel who had never once, not even accidentally, made me feel invisible. I'd started to feel like maybe the pattern was something I could leave behind. Like it only had power when I was inside it. I made one mistake. I let myself want something from my family again. I planned a birthday dinner back home. Simple. Elegant. Just us four, at a restaurant I'd chosen carefully. I drove 2 hours to get there. I bought a dress I'd saved for. I had been quietly excited about it for weeks, and I hadn't let myself show that excitement to anyone because I was still, even then, still protecting myself from hoping too hard. I should have listened to that instinct. The morning of my 21st birthday, my phone rang at 9:14. I still remember that. 9:14. My mother's name on the screen. Renata had been in a car accident. Minor. No injuries. A dented bumper in a parking lot. She was, in my mother's careful words, shaken. They were going to spend the day with her. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dress I had saved for, and I listened to my mother explain, in that particular tone she reserved for these conversations, apologetic but faintly impatient, like my reaction was the inconvenient part. Why they couldn't come. And something in me stopped. Not broke. Not cracked. Stopped. Like a clock running down. I said, "Okay, Mom. I hope Renata feels better." I drove back to university. I took off the dress. I went to dinner with Daniel and 2 friends who had been my backup plan, the people I had already known I could count on. And when I got home that night, I made a decision that I did not announce and did not explain and did not revisit. I was done. Not angry done. Not dramatic done. Just done in the way you are when something has finally, completely, irreversibly run out. When there's nothing left to compress because there's nothing left. I stopped calling home. I stopped returning calls when they came. I spent the holidays I had always spent with my family with Daniel's family instead, people who set an extra place without being asked and who never once made me feel like my presence required an apology. I did not attend Renata's wedding. I did not send a card. I did not go back. 9 years passed. And I built the life I had always been building quietly, steadily, without their approval or their attention. I became someone I recognized. Someone who didn't pack herself down to fit inside someone else's comfort. And then one morning I looked through my front door's peephole and my parents were standing on my porch. They looked like people who had finally run out of easier options. I did not open the door immediately. I stood there with my hand flat against the frame and I breathed. In and out. Slowly. The way my therapist had taught me back in the years when I was still learning how to feel things without immediately managing them. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even particularly surprised. I had been warned, after a fashion. I had known this was coming for almost 2 years. I had spent that time getting ready. What I needed, in those 30 seconds before I opened the door, was to remember who I was now. Not the 9-year-old lying in the dark, not the girl in the birthday dress sitting alone with a dead phone. Someone else. Someone who had built something real from the ruins of what that family had refused to give her. I opened the door. My father looked like he'd been quietly collapsing for a long time. My mother's eyes went directly to my face the way they used to when I was small, and she was trying to read whether I was going to make something difficult. Old reflex. I watched her run it, and I didn't give her anything to read. I stepped aside. They came in. I brought water. I let them sit. I sat across from them. I waited. My mother spoke first. She had clearly rehearsed. There was a shape to what she said, an opening that acknowledged wrongdoing, a middle that explained how they had come to see things differently, a closing that reached toward the possibility of repair. It was the most organized she had ever been about me. She said, "We let her take everything from you. We told ourselves we were keeping the peace. We weren't. We were keeping her comfortable." I let the words land. My father said something quieter. He said, "You were never the easy one. We just made you carry everything alone and called it easy." His voice fractured at the end of it. I did not cry. I had cried about this a long time ago, in the specific and necessary way that you cry when you finally let yourself feel something you've been managing for 20 years. I had nothing left to cry about in front of them. I said, "I know why you're here. It's not just because of me." The silence that followed confirmed it before either of them spoke. Here's what I knew. Here's what I had known for 22 months. My cousin Petra, the one quiet ally I had kept through everything, the one thread connecting me to that world, had called me on an ordinary Tuesday morning nearly 2 years before my parents appeared at my door. She hadn't opened with small talk. She'd said, "Something's happening with Renata. I thought you should know." It came out in pieces across several conversations over several weeks. Without me to absorb the excess of Renata's needs, she had simply redirected. The crises hadn't stopped. They'd intensified. My parents were her entire support infrastructure now, and she had expanded into every square inch of the space I had left behind. The emotional strain first. Constant calls at all hours. Catastrophes without solutions that cycled endlessly. My parents had spent 9 years as the only support system for a woman who had never once been asked to develop her own. Then came the money. It started the way these things always start. A difficult month. A loan that was never documented because of course you don't document things between family. Then another difficult month. Then a business idea that needed a small investment. Then the business collapsing. Then another crisis. Then another loan. I didn't see the full number until Petra sent me the bank statement my mother had shown her in a moment of overwhelmed desperation. $230,000. Over 7 years. Gone. Not stolen in a single dramatic act, but extracted in the slow, incremental, perfectly calibrated way that Renata had always operated. A little at a time. Always with a reason. Always with a recovery story attached that never materialized. And then the money was gone. And then her second marriage ended. And then she moved in with someone new. And then she stopped answering my parents' calls. My parents, at 64 and 67, were staring at a retirement account that had been quietly emptied while they were busy telling themselves they were helping. That was why they were standing in my living room. And that was when I gave my father the folder. I had prepared it over the course of 18 months. Not in anger. In the careful, methodical way I had learned to do important things, collecting information, understanding options, building a case. I had spoken with a financial elder abuse attorney. I had researched the specific statutes in my parents' state. I had connected, through a nonprofit legal advocacy network with a specialist in exactly this kind of case. The folder contained the attorney's name and contact information. It contained a plain language summary of their legal options. It contained a note in my handwriting that said the first 2 consultations were already paid for. My mother started to cry when she opened it. I said, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because she will do this to someone else if she isn't stopped. She has already done this to me. I'm not going to be the only person who absorbs what she is without consequence." That was the thing I had needed to say for 30 years. The attorney took the case. What followed over the next 14 months was not clean or cinematic. It was slow and procedural, and it required my parents to sit in rooms and answer questions and sign documents and face, with brutal clarity, the full accounting of what they had allowed to happen, both the money and the years before it. I gave a formal statement, not in a courtroom but in a deposition, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a conference room with beige walls and bad lighting. I sat across from a legal assistant I had never met, and I told the truth about my family for the first time in my life, with no softening, no omissions, no careful management of how it would land. I told them about every birthday. I named dates. I described patterns. I explained, in plain, unemotional language, what systematic favoritism looks like from the inside and how it functioned as a mechanism that allowed one person to continuously exploit a family structure while another person was trained to absorb the cost quietly. Renata's attorney objected to the relevance. The mediator overruled. The financial records told most of the story without me. Renata had been careless because she had never encountered resistance. The transfers were largely undocumented. Several had occurred during periods where my parents were demonstrably under emotional duress, a fact that mattered legally. Her newer accounts showed that money had moved quickly into a boutique business she'd opened. That business became part of the proceedings. The judgment came down on a Thursday. Renata was ordered to repay a structured amount, with terms and timelines and consequences for noncompliance. The boutique's financial irregularities, surfaced during discovery, triggered a separate inquiry. Her business license was flagged. The local news ran a brief item about the case, not front page, not dramatic, just 3 factual paragraphs about a fraud judgment in a civil proceeding. It was enough. In a town where Renata had spent years building a persona as someone effortlessly charming and perpetually victimized, 3 factual paragraphs destroyed more than a decade of careful social construction. The calls she'd cultivated dried up. The people who had enabled her with sympathy and attention and small loans of their own began quietly comparing notes. Her partner, who had not known the full shape of what he was living with, moved out within 6 weeks of the judgment. She called my parents. She screamed at them for an hour about betrayal and cruelty and how they had chosen me over her, which would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so perfectly, completely predictable. They had finally, at 64 and 67, after a lifetime of the opposite, chosen themselves. And to Renata, that registered as a betrayal so profound she could not process it. They did not apologize. They did not negotiate. They let her finish and said goodbye and ended the call. She called me once. On a Sunday morning, early, the way she'd always timed her crises for maximum disruption. My phone lit up with a number I had blocked for 9 years and somehow unblocked during the legal process because the attorney had needed me accessible. I watched it ring. I let it go to voicemail. I never listened to it. My relationship with my parents now is not what it was and is not what it could have been. It is something smaller and more honest. We talk on the phone every few weeks. They came to my birthday last year, the first one they'd attended since I was 8 years old, and they sat at my table surrounded by the people I had chosen, the friends who had shown up for me in every way my family never had. And they were quiet and grateful and careful in the way of people who understand they are guests in a life they didn't build. Daniel made the cake. Petra came. We lit the candles and the room was full and warm and entirely mine. Renata was not there. Renata had not been invited. And as I looked around that table at the people who had chosen me freely, without obligation, without the performance of love that substitutes for the real thing, I felt something settle into place. Something that had been waiting a long time to land. She spent 30 years making sure I knew I was second. I spent 9 years proving I didn't need to be anyone's first. And when she finally fell, when the pattern she had run her whole life finally ran out of people willing to absorb it, there was no one left to catch her. Not because I destroyed her. Because I simply stopped being the reason she never had to face herself. She didn't just lose me. She lost the only person whose silence had been holding everything else together.